Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and welcome back to the Arsenal. And this week, because we're doing everything Romulan we possibly can, we're going to be looking at plasma torpedoes. Now, we're not just going to be looking at plasma torpedoes, we're going to look at the whole development tree, the whole development story of Romulan weaponry, and how the plasma torpedo fits into that, what happened to it, where did it go, what replaced it, and what came before. But before we get into that, this video is brought to you by Astro Kings. Astro Kings is the ultimate real-time sci-fi mobile game, free to play and available on all devices. Forge humanity's path into the stars, rebuild a ruined planet, and restore it to its former glory. All the while, you must repel aliens and pirates who seek to drive your world back into the dirt from whence it came. Then build a fleet of starships, ranging from interceptors to cruisers and motherships, and then take the fight to those aliens and pirates who once sought to destroy you. Form alliances by creating a planetary embassy, and join a galactic federation with other players, and engage in epic PvP battles. This month, Astro Kings is celebrating its 4-year anniversary. Enter the promo code AK40H, and you can claim special anniversary rewards until September 4th. Click the link below or scan the QR code on screen and start playing today. Thank you, Astro Kings, for supporting this video. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. So the first thing to talk about is that Romulan use of plasma-based weaponry, just generally, ultimately comes as a result of the Romulans being big on their fusion drives. Yes, other powers used fusion drives in their early stages. So, for example, humans used fusion drives for early space travel. I'm sure the Klingons did. So on and so forth. But the Romulans kept using them. They kept using that technology. Because ultimately, the Romulans were masters of gravitic manipulation. And that then feeds into other technologies that they would later develop, like the cloaking device, or the artificial quantum singularity. But we're here to discuss Romulan weaponry and the plasma torpedo, so we'll start at the beginning. So, the first weapon we're going to talk about is the Forced Plasma Beam. This is from the Romulan Earth War, probably a little bit before, and was used after, up to the mid-23rd century. It was on its way out, but they still liked to try and use it, but it was quite an old technology. It's very, very primitive. It's a primitive plasma weapon. Basically, you're just taking your plasma exhaust and shunting it through your, whatever your main emitter assembly is, and using it as a weapon. Really not much more beyond that. You're just taking all that horrible raw, highly radioactive, highly energetic, hot plasma from your reactor, and you're just shooting it at the enemy in a concentrated beam. Emphasis there is that it is a beam weapon, and that does have significant impacts on its use and what it can actually do. So it was extremely powerful. It could essentially, I say one-hit ships. I will go into a little bit more detail on that. And it could melt planets and structures. It was very good at that. But it did basically drain your entire power grid. You basically were shutting off everything. Impulsor units, stuff like that. You know, you're shutting off everything just to fire this weapon. And yeah, it was powerful, but you were going in unpowered for the most part. They did kind of better integrate it so that you could fire it without, losing power to everything else. But initially, and it was still very much used in that fashion that, basically if you were going to fire this weapon, that was all you were going to do. Now, I said it one-hit ships, but there's also another key thing. So because it draws energy from the power grid, another issue is that it cannot be used immediately. You have to set aside the energy to charge it. So oftentimes the enemy, particularly what would happen later in the Earth War, once Starfleet became wise to Romulan tactics, is they would realize that, a Romulan ship decelerates, and they would realize, oh wait, they're charging their plasma beam, get out the way. And the other thing is that it does damage over time. This is the most important part. So yes, it does one-hit ships, particularly 22nd century ships that are basically just hull plating. But when you start putting shields into the equation, stuff that actually will protect the ship and give it time to get out the way of the beam or to evade the beam, then you start getting into problems. Then you start not actually one-hitting ships, and they were, maybe you get an initial hit, but the beam wouldn't stay on long enough to destroy them. And, you've just put all your energy into this big attack, and so you're left quite vulnerable to a counter. So it would often lose out to more agile starships like the Freedom class and the NX class, which were much more advanced than the run-of-the-mill Earth ships of the period. And the other thing is that it doesn't work well with cloaking tactics. It requires you to expose yourself, very obviously. You have to, keep firing that beam for an amount of time in order for it to work. It's not something where you can just fire and forget. So in terms of ships that it was used on, you're looking at all the ships of the Romulan Earth War, the Cabbage, the Chowder, and the Clavicle, but not actually the Tavaro, that used a plasma phaser. In the 23rd century, it would be featured on the Thry class and the Veterix, which was, as well as some versions of the Stormbird, which we've already covered. But it doesn't really work, especially in the 23rd century. It was good for the Romulan Earth War. A lot of Starfleet ships were destroyed with forced plasma beams, and a lot of continents were melted with forced plasma beams. In that, it was excellent. But the key problem for it in the 23rd century is it just didn't work with cloak tactics, because you had to charge the weapon before firing. You couldn't save up energy in like a capacitor and then fire when ready. You had to immediately charge and fire. So yeah, that wasn't so great. And then when you couple that with having the cloaking device, okay, you get yourself concealed, but then you have to decloak, charge the weapon, fire, stay on target, remain exposed while you're melting the enemy, who is going to be much more evasive, because this is a modern starship which is shielded and much more agile than a ship of the 22nd century. So yeah, it was kind of on its way out during the 23rd century, and a new rival would quickly appear. And that is the main topic of this video: the plasma torpedo launcher. So ultimately, the plasma torpedo launcher is an evolution of the forced plasma beam. It's really very simple. It's just, rather than taking all that plasma and basically directly shunting it out of the main emitter and directly using all that reactor plasma, instead what you're doing is you're collecting it in a reservoir, you're collecting in a charged state, getting that ready to fire, and then just firing this concentrated bolt of plasma when you want. Now that has a lot of good effects. So essentially what you have is a magnetically formed projectile. Early plasma torpedo launchers might actually have a solid core in the center, just something to form the torpedo around. Later ones wouldn't bother with that. They could just fire a pure plasma torpedo. But essentially the system was very effective because you could passively recharge the weapon whilst doing other things, whilst being under cloak, whilst being under thrust. It could charge up on its own separately without you having to stop everything, stop what you're doing, and just charge that weapon. The other thing is that effectively you would get more yield per shot. Now, that's highly debatable. It depends how, with the forced plasma beam, it depended how long you kept your target on for. If you're shooting at a planet or a stationary target with a forced plasma beam, you'll probably be alright, and actually, over time, you'll do more damage than you could do than with a plasma torpedo. But on moving targets, you're very unlikely to get that level of energy into that level of damage on a target before it evades the plasma beam, whereas you can with a plasma torpedo. So that's why it's much more effective for that. So it can't be. It has some passive guidance, which basically, again, that's part of it being a magnetic projectile. It's not guidance, so to say, as it is just it's a magnetic. It has a magnetic field, and it's attracted to other magnetic fields. So it will sort of slowly eke towards a target. Emphasis there on slowly. If you fire from too long range, yeah, they're going to evade you, but it will be much harder to evade at short range. So, with a greater yield per shot, the ability to passively recharge while doing other things, it's very useful for hit and run tactics. It's good on structures still, although, depending on what you're targeting, if you're targeting a planet, unless you've got a lot of plasma torpedo launchers, yeah, you probably would have been better off with the force plasma beam, provided that is that the planet isn't going to shoot back. If we're talking about any kind of instance where the target is going to evade you or shoot back, then the plasma torpedo is far more ideal, because it will allow you to take a shot, minimize your exposure, and then cloak again. So it fits very well with the cloaking tactics. It does have limited range, but again, because you're using a cloaking device, it doesn't matter so much. I mean, anti-cloaking tactics would improve, and specifically, detecting a cloaked ship in proximity to your ship at a range where they might use a plasma torpedo. Yeah, that was considered pretty high priority for Starfleet, and it wasn't quite that easy to get the drop on them, but still, it was a very effective threat. In terms of ships that used the plasma torpedo launcher, you're looking at a whole variety of ships. You're looking at the Tallis, obviously, the Tallis refit, some versions of the D7, the Gallant Wing, the Nova class, the Winged Defender. The Winged Defender actually uses extended barrels on its plasma torpedo launchers, which are carried on the underside of the hull. Those are much more focused towards anti-starship work, but even then, they're still plasma torpedoes. They'll still knock 7 bells out of any stationary target or fortification. Now, the key issue was that it became less and less effective on newer shields. Remember, when we see the plasma torpedo launcher in Balance of Terror, this is on the pre-refit Enterprise with the old Archer-style engine with a much lower power output. When we get to the films, and when we get to sort of the period we're covering, vertical warp cores have been introduced, and these have a much greater power output, and mean that the Enterprise's shields are much stronger. Now, it's initially you probably wouldn't notice much of a difference. The Enterprise might be able to tank one plasma torpedo hit, but it's not going to enjoy doing that, and if there's more on the way, you're going to be in trouble. I mean, I've seen some people say that because the Enterprise's shields were able to survive V'Ger and the Katingas weren't, therefore the Enterprise could survive plasma torpedoes. I know that V'Ger's weapon is described as a plasma torpedo. I would say it's something very different. I like it, I think it's a cool weapon, but I don't think it's the same as the Romulan plasma torpedo. It might be similar, but yeah, I wouldn't use that as a basis to say anything too definitively. It remained an excellent planet killer and was very useful in starship combat for a long time. But it would eventually become increasingly outmoded by the next two weapons we're going to talk about. The next iteration on this evolutionary tree is the Plasma Disruptor. Now, this is actually a direct descendant of the forced plasma beam. It basically uses a combination of refined electroplasma and antiprotons along with a magnetic accelerator barrel, which is the main difference disruptors have from phasers. Phasers combine electroplasma, laser, crystal, and magnetic accelerator barrel to form a phaser, whereas disruptors just use electroplasma, antiprotons, and a magnetic accelerator barrel. The main effect is that it is far more destructive than a phaser, though it does suffer greater damage drop-off. They are much more short-range weapons. It's hard to really define when the plasma disruptor entered service, but it is a native Romulan technology. It's not one that they are copying from the Klingons. And this particular weapon system would continue into the 24th century. It has improved range compared to a forced plasma beam. It's got about mid-range. You're still better at close range. You will suffer less damage drop-off. It has a good rate of fire, particularly compared to phasers. It's a good general purpose weapon. You can use it for just general suppressive fire, as well as bringing to effect more lethal fire at close range. And it can stack damage. It still does plasma damage, which means that it stacks damage. It basically, each time you hit someone with a plasma weapon, cloud of residual plasma remains around the target, and each successive hit, that reignites some of that residual plasma, and that generally the amount of damage you do will multiply as the engagement plays out. So it was still very good for that. And particularly when you're talking about using multiple plasma disruptors on a target from different ships, you can very quickly overwhelm a target with that kind of firepower, which is what the Diduridax would do. That was its primary weapon, was the plasma disruptor, not torpedoes. So that's really the main Romulan armament for, well, the late 23rd and the rest of the 24th century going into the future. Finally, we get the successor to the plasma torpedo. We get the cased plasma torpedo now. That is kind of what it sounds like. It's essentially a plasma warhead, not quite as strong, not nearly as strong as a plasma torpedo, but it's cased, which means it has a far greater range. It entered service in the early 24th century, once the Romulans had gotten hold of enough Klingon torpedo technology after Praxis. And ultimately it replaced the old plasma torpedo launcher because you had much better range, the weapon was guided, active guidance, and it was only slightly weaker than a photon torpedo, but because it had a plasma warhead, it allowed you to continue stacking plasma damage on a target. You know, it's also worth remarking upon the change that happens from 23rd century Romulan ships to 24th century Romulan ships. 23rd century Romulan ships are incredibly weak and want to minimize their exposure to enemy fire as much as possible. 24th century Romulan ships are generally much stronger, much more capable of taking fire, and thus are less concerned with minimizing engagement times and, you know, cloak and poke tactics. They're much more happy to just brawl it out when necessary. Although they still will cloak and poke if they feel like it, but generally they've got enough firepower and enough strength behind them now that they're happy to take on to engage in a head-on fight. So this was basically added to the arsenal of serving ships. It can be fired out of a photon torpedo tube, which is another useful thing. You didn't have to carry around all these, you know, as great as the Nova class was, one of the issues you have with that ship is that it is carrying around 3 separate weapon systems that all operate differently and are doing different things. You have the disruptors, you have the torpedo tubes, which fire photon torpedoes, and you have the plasma torpedo launchers. And these are all separate systems, all doing different things. And those are that's 3 different weapon systems to maintain. You can see where this kind of becomes a problem. And this is why the Romulans wanted to rationalize and homogenize their ordnance so that they could, you know, simplify the loadouts of each ship and still be doing relatively the same thing as before. So ultimately it would replace the old plasma torpedo launcher because it worked better with, as I alluded to before, it worked better with warbird tactics. Like I say, they're much more willing to expose themselves, and the key thing, rather than getting that alpha strike in as they needed to in the 23rd century because they couldn't survive taking return fire, they didn't want to take any return fire in the 23rd century. So then they were very keen on alpha strikes and taking out the enemy as quickly as possible. In the 24th century, they're much more interested in, general overall battle fighting. It's no longer about being able to one-hit one enemy ship at close range before they even know what's happened. They're much more interested in that war-fighting, battle-fighting capability of their ships to engage multiple targets at once. And that's really kind of why the cased plasma torpedo would replace the old plasma torpedo launcher. And that's really the story of the plasma torpedo. That is, its origins, what it was, how it worked, and what happened to it ultimately. Ultimately, it all descends from forced plasma beams and the Romulan use of fusion. The main shaping principle that kind of the main principle which gives the plasma torpedo its life is the cloaking device. And actually that keeps it very relevant for a very long time and very viable for a long time. Even into the early 24th century, when you would think such a short-range situational weapon would be less viable. But the cloaking device keeps it competitive, keeps it relevant. But then it kind of lives and dies by its own sword, because then as quantum singularities come in, as the bigger warbirds come in, which to an extent, particularly being used aboard the Nova, the plasma torpedo almost helped to usher in, because it showed the Romulans the viability of large warships. And that in itself then is what precipitates the change in doctrine, the change of tactics, that leads to it falling out of favor in favor of the cased plasma torpedo. And so while in the 24th century, Romulan weaponry appears to be a lot more like everyone else's weaponry, it's come up this very different evolutionary tree, and you can really, it really is an example of the devil's in the details. And in the details, you see that very distinct path of technology that the Romulans came up compared to the other Alpha Quadrant powers. Thank you guys for watching, and thank you to Astro Kings for sponsoring this video. Link in the description, scan the QR code, support the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will now thank my members. My Navarks: David Reeves, Tully DT, Jeffrey Ballard, and Martin McConville. My Commanders: Channel has been deleted, Miami Jules, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Ty, Captain Striker, Jeff Hallam, Bird Monster, Mark Philippe, and Robert Sampson. And my Centurions: Nathaniel Mead, Pendlebury, BOS Domestic Disputes, Marcus Hall, Adam Bowman, Paul Lash, and Julian Arnott. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.